Hello, strangers. You've stumbled across another secret holiday, and with it, a very special story. This is story number 2.
My mom's always been a runner, as has my dad, and me as well. We aren't built for speed. There aren't any glorious pictures at the finish line snapping the paper strip in our family photo albums. For us, it was always about endurance. It's not as flashy, but as my dad, a beat cop at the time, would often tell us, it was all about the wind. On any foot pursuit, he could pace with them, tire them out. There'd be no fight left in them, and no need for fighting or anyone getting hurt. That my father stood in his stocking feet a hair below 5'10", and was the kind of lean that could, and had to my mother's embarrassment, led to him accidentally pulling on a pair of his wife's jeans when getting dressed in the dark. Well, that didn't matter. He had the wind, and all the confidence it brought. But this is not my father's story. While he does have some choice lines, this one is all about my mother, in her running tights, slipping outside on a biting cold and dark morning in late fall. The route my mother took varied on a number of factors. On this particular morning, the factors bore out a long, punishing run in the dark, in the cold. Her hair in a high ponytail, off she set, swishing of the ugly by necessity windbreaker drowned out by her Walkman. She chose a particularly hilly route, out past 2 dozy suburban streets, Parker Street and Malay Court, over a bridge and down a broad 2-laner that had been built, presumptuously, leading into a planned subdivision that had stalled at the foundations and framing. As my mom headed towards Parker Street and the bridge, however, there was a stillness that momentarily stuttered her step. True, it was dark, and early. Cars were sparse, and birds hadn't yet begun their singing. That was all normal. But this wasn't the gentle quiet of a slumbering suburb. My mom reached into the pocket of her windbreaker and snapped off her Walkman. No, this wasn't a dozy silence. It was tense. Even the few streetlights didn't seem to offer her light so much as stare at her, yellow arc sodiums watching her approach. The dark, she told me, seemed awake and alive. In fact, she nearly turned around right before the 2nd Street, Malay Court, before she even made it to the bridge. But just as she paused to turn, the headlights of a car flashed. A late 80s SUV came trundling over the crest of the hill, splashing over the bridge like the asphalt had been cannonballed by light. It broke that eerie, early silence with the squeal of a fan belt nearing its limit. My mom immediately took a sprint step past the yawning mouth of Malay Court and onto the sidewalk of the bridge. The homeowners of the house on the corner had allowed a juniper bush hedge free rein, and it had thus grown out into the sidewalk, slapping at her side and shoulder as she barreled past, but she was too busy mocking herself to notice. A woman in her 30s getting spooked by, what? The dark? She leaned into the incline and bounded up the hill, leaving her gut feeling long behind her. Mostly. But as the bones of the unfinished houses of the subdivision sprang from the dark horizon, the gut feeling, using a quiet little voice, began to talk to her. Something had been watching, waiting, it persisted. Maybe not for her specifically. But hadn't she presented such an unassuming target? A woman who looked younger than she was, often carded over a glass of wine, wearing a big swishy jacket you could hear coming. When those headlights came over the hill and hit her, she probably lit up like a Christmas tree. My mom ran on, trying to outrun her instinct, every step a clear, no, shh, stop it. but she didn't turn the Walkman back on. The main course of the run was that abandoned subdivision. Up and down the sheepish streets of the little tract, stuck in the build phase for over a year now, it felt like the place was reduced to waiting meekly by the punch bowl like an abandoned prom date. My mom ran on, only noticing when she'd wound her way through it. She was so distracted, she didn't even realize she'd finished her run through it until she'd already exited the housing tract again. My mom knew she'd pushed her speed, and inwardly cursed for letting the little nagging voice in her head spook her so much. Now all that was left was back down the bridge, past Melee Court and Parker Street, and home again, jiggity jig. She'd sped up so much, in fact, that she'd played herself. At her usual pace, the dawn would have come, and with it, light more consistent than the random car coming to her nocturnal lighting emergency rescue. The telltale pinch in her side, the slight whistle in her breathing, all signs she'd really given it that day. Oh well, home was practically in sight. Down the bridge she came, and just as suddenly as she'd cut off the Walkman, her own thoughts were silenced by her quiet little voice. Only this time, it wasn't so little. It roared so loudly and suddenly that my mom nearly turned her head as if to look for it. It was an insane chant, too frantic for clear sentences. Pat, oh Pat, this is Pat. It's been waiting. It's here. Oh God, oh no, Pat, so Pat. And it socked her in the gut. Her side stitched in sympathy. Something was wrong. Something was dead wrong. And as she began to leave the bridge, Melee Court yawning open on her right as though to swallow her up, she knew it. Almost home. Just gotta make it 3 blocks. Kick it into gear, she thought, against the mindless droning of that internal voice. As she prepared to cross Melee Court, she brought up her right arm, ready to bat the intrusive hedge away. And as she did, the litany of words became only one. Run! And overcoming our shared genetic disposition, our value of distance over quick pace, my mom ran. She sprinted. There was no doubt, there was no rationalizing, and there never had been. A fact as absolute as breathing was here, and it was run. As she pelted her feet across the uncaring asphalt, the juniper bush gave her a slap across her back, almost grasping at her. She didn't dare turn to look, not until she'd made it past Parker Street. Tossing a look behind her, she saw the hedge shaking like a dog settling down from a dream. Bile rose, burning in her throat, and snapping her eyes front, she sprinted on, flying past the last 2 blocks like her life depended on it. And knowing without being able to know, she knew it did. So single-minded was she that it wasn't until she'd flown up the porch steps into our house, door slamming so violently behind her a picture fell off the wall, that she finally came to a stop. My dad, just up himself and with sleep corkscrews still in his dark, thick hair, came stumbling out of the bathroom. My mom tried to talk, to tell, but her chest was sucking for air and was far too greedy to allow her a puff to speak. Legs trembling, she half fell to her knees, then bent over so far her forehead nearly touched the ground. Over her panting, she heard my dad say something like, "Cover you." What? She managed to puff, blood roaring in her ears. My dad at first didn't repeat himself, instead taking her hands and pulling them up high to rest on top of her head the way all runners know to do, to expand their chests and help their battered lungs recoup their tapped stores. She kneeled there like a suspect, docile in her complete lack of go for a few minutes. Her breathing eased, and gradually she looked to my father's face, expecting to see his concern ebb immediately. It hadn't, though. As she started to rise, he finally repeated himself. "What's all over your back?" "It's all pink." My mom gaped, then tried to look over her shoulder before moving dull-witted hands down to the zipper of her jacket. The zipper caught, but she ripped it down and the windbreaker off, and with no hesitation she snapped it out in front of her like a crumpled pillowcase, ready for the hamper. My mom said that her stomach dropped, splashing more bile up in her throat. My dad was right. The jacket's back was spattered, and what looked, ironically, like pink bismuth. As they stood there in the entryway, mutely reviewing the jacket, they both suddenly caught sight of the same detail in the strawberry milk-colored blotches. On the right, near her shoulder, took on a very familiar shape, that of a human handprint. My father took the jacket with him to work. He returned home with the story, for which the windbreaker had been traded, being tucked into a rustly paper bag with a white checklist labeled "Evidence" attached. The story he told began the same as many in my childhood, and likely yours too. A boy met a girl, and love blossomed. But unlike most childhood stories, so did the boy's love of methamphetamine. It sank its teeth into the boy and wouldn't release him for anything. One battle in rehab later, he returned to her. She believed him when he told her it was over. She had his word that he would fight it forever, and she believed in him. 10 months later, 2 things had happened. A baby girl was born unto the boy and girl, her rosy cheeks and impossible white blonde curls full of promise and life. And secondly, the girl was finally forced to face the fact that the boy's promise to stay off of drugs had been broken. With the stress of a baby in the house, the mask the boy wore broke. A dragon rampaged, wearing his face all through the house, through their finances, and all through the happy memories they had shared, turning all to ash. The girl did what she could to protect her baby. The dragon attacked, leaving bruises and broken teeth. She had no choice but to call the cops. These reinforcement knights arrived and subdued the dragon. Court, uncomfortable shoes and sterile air. The girl's battle continued, now against judgmental stares lobbed like spears, and finding their mark, piercing the cheap sweater set the victim's advocate had dressed her in. Why did she stay? What kind of self-respecting woman would? What kind of mother? But unlike the boy, she won her fight. The court decreed her victory. The bars clanged. 2 years of promised freedom, with a protective order for good measure. She began to rebuild her life. They moved houses, eventually settling in with a friend. The girl picked up her life, sheltering in the 2 years like a trench. As she had been saved by the dragon by the court, though, so was the boy saved from the dragon's needle teeth himself, by virtue of lockup. 2 years became 18 months from his sudden good behavior. The danger was past, their fears rationalized much like my mom's first sense had been, extinguished in bright fluorescent light like a baptism. They released him early, and the court, the jail, and those well-meaning knights of the Order of the Thin Blue Line, lulled and dozy, forgot to notify her. The boy wasted no time in shedding the docile disguise, for, as you must have guessed, he'd always been a dragon, and the boy always a mask. The meth just made what was already there come through. It took a week and a half for him to resume his habit and locate his prey. A girl and baby, now 2 1/4, with a cheery cackle laugh and a love of finger paints and Cheerios, who had taken refuge with a friend on a little cul-de-sac street called Melee Court. That's right. The quiet little voice in my mom's head had picked up on the danger that lurked in that house. For as my mom ran past the house on Malay Court, the boy, now man, was already inside, having broken through a window. He'd strangled the friend, then moved on to the kitchen to locate a knife, which he'd used against his former love. Whether it be because he was high out of his gourd, or acting on a crime of passion, the man had missed the toddler, but he hadn't missed stumbling into a set of finger paints left on the floor, knocking over a couple, and dropping the knife into a shade known as Princess Palace Pink. Only after retrieving the knife did he seem to remember the danger of being discovered where he was. At which point, he did the sensible thing and walked out the front door, lingering in the front yard to make good his escape. He hadn't planned to grab after my mother. She'd truly startled him from what he could recall. And that's it. That's the story. My mom usually has some sort of additional sarcastic remark about how her gut instinct did a better job of warning them of the danger than even the police did. The kind of comment that makes my dad sort of grumble and move to the study. To this day, my mom still runs, as does my dad and as do I. It's our shared family trait. Adding race teas to bins relegated in the attic. But these well-attended, daylit races aside, one factor is permanently fixed in my mom's math for morning runs now. Before, she always took into account distance on whether or not she'd be taking a dog with her. Now, distance or no, the answer for take the dog is always a yes.
You might say my family is a little unusual. I mean, the kind of parents that raise the kind of girl who sits alone in the dark and tells spooky stories to strangers on the internet. Well, they're probably not the Brady Bunch. It's sort of why I got into telling these stories, though. These little bits of family lore that, frankly, aren't going to make their way into the scrapbooks or onto an ancestry website. That's the cool thing about telling a story like this. Now it lives on, in the heads of anybody who listens. So thank you for listening. Take care, my friendly strangers, and happy birthday, Mom.